sharing of experiences, but also research and knowledge on women's access to land. And we know that it's one of the most pressing issues on the continent today. There are many issues, and most of those lie around the policy, legal environment. And we're going to have a presentation here, a panel, with experiences from a few countries. We know, for example, that Mozambique is regarded as having one of the most progressive laws, land laws on the continent, and is embarking on a process or program for the privatization of land. We know from where we come from that countries have gone through different challenges when we start talking privatization of land. We will hear from Mozambique. On the other hand, and this is on the southern region, we have Zimbabwe. Who hasn't heard about Zimbabwean land? Is there anyone? Like, you talk radical, you talk Zimbabwe. Yes. And so we'll hear that with all their radical land policy reforms, and of course we all know that the most radical in the world, to say, post-Cold War, is Zimbabwe's land policy. But how has that dealt with the question of women's land rights? And how has that helped in the fight for women's land rights? So this panel comprises of, I'm going to just say the names, please come up. At the end, I'll say why I'm just calling one name. Samantha, are you in the house? Please come up. Honorable Lynette, are you in the house? Come up. Nalendi, please do come up. Dr. Filian, are you in the house? Where are you? I asked him yesterday, why is he at our conference? He has to give us a justification for why he's here. Mathilde, you're welcome. And now I'm going to invite Hirut. Hirut will moderate this session. So I have the best job in the world to introduce the panelists and the moderator. Hirut, I've known her as a gender, very tough knuckle, mean business kind of girl. So she'll take us through this session, and I hope we will have a great time listening to them. Also, take notes so that you ask all the difficult questions, because you have the brains here. Yeah? Thank you. You're welcome, Hirut, take over.
Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon. I hope you are having a nice break. Welcome to the session on building collective agency to secure women's land rights on the continent. Since we've already introduced the panel, I'll just say which institutions they represent or stakeholder groups, so you can see that we have an inclusive group here, both of state and non-state actors. So starting from the Rex, we have seated here to my we have Lynn Karenji, who's the Deputy Chairperson of Human and Social Development Committee for the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Also from Zimbabwe, and representing the Civil Society Group and the youth, we have Samantha. From neighboring South Africa and bringing the perspective of the gender machinery, we have, I keep mispronouncing her name, so I've been practicing it. Nanendi. And she is the acting head of research and policy for the Commission for Gender Equality. Last but not least, and the only male on the panel, is Dr. Filian. He is a senior researcher at CLASS, the Institute for Poverty and Agrarian Studies, and also the organizer of this policy forum. Help me welcome the panel. This session is structured in 3 pieces. So the first piece will be contextualizing the issues of women's land rights on the continent. I will start out by doing that. So we'll talk about some of the common issues that we see across the continent and some of the continental response to addressing those issues. This will help us anchor the discussion going forward. The second part is the meat of the discussion, and you'll hear from the various panelists from their respective perspective and experience. And then we will turn to you, the participants, to further enrich the conversation. We'll allow you to share your own take on things and your perspectives and your wealth of experience in the field and in the government structure as well. The questions for the forum will be around 4 themes. The 4 themes will all focus on governance and land service delivery. So this is the 4 thematic areas that you'll be hearing for going forward. I'll start out by contextualizing the issues, and then we will hear from our various panelists. So, as has been said in earlier discussions, both today and yesterday, the ecosystems around women's land rights are quite complex and interrelated. So it's difficult to just speak of the issues because they're so nuanced in reality. But just bearing in mind that we're speaking of the common issues, but it's important to bear in mind that the issue is both complex and highly contextual. So you have the differences within a country, much less across countries. So when we're referring to particular problems, we're not saying it's a specific problem within each context, but these are some of the common things that come up. Also, we know that women's land rights are not experienced in the same way across the group, because women are not a homogeneous society or members of a homogeneous group. So there are variables that will affect that. So it's important to bear in mind the diverse profile of women, and as you know, that their rights are affected not only by their geography, but also their status, both in terms of their economic status, their political status, and another important one is their marital status. So bear that in mind. And then age is another variable that's important to the discussion. Somebody was saying earlier that they felt like women's land rights have been sufficiently addressed, or maybe in the future we'll be turning to looking at youth. But I think we have to look at youth even as we speak, because we're looking at the female child as well when we're looking at land rights. So that conversation is already taking place within this context, and it's just yet another variable to bear in mind. So getting to the common issues. The first one again is this ecosystem being a system of not just land rights within the policy or legal framework, but also the religious laws within a particular context, the customary system. So we're using legal systems. When we refer to the legal system, we're not limiting it to just the formal policies and laws, but we're also looking at the customary systems within that context and the religious laws that would apply. The second point I wanted to emphasize before going into the complexities, well, actually we can get to it because I wanted some of the panelists to speak to that, so I leave that one alone for now. So because we have these coexisting systems of the formal system as well as the religious and the customary systems, they often contradict one another, and most of the time to the disadvantage of women. So I will give an example just to illustrate that point. So we know that in Africa, about 50% of the countries have formally recognized customary systems in law. So there's a statutory recognition or constitutional recognition of the statute of the customary system in law. But in doing so, a third of those countries have not included a provision that says that the recognition is contingent on the consistency of the customary systems with the gender protection in the law. So you would have, in a context like such, you would have a woman who may have been discriminated under the customary tenure, but she can't then rely on the formal systems for protection because it's recognized that without that contingency, that it has to be consistent with the gender responsive provisions of statutory law. So that's one of the legal issues we see in multiple countries across the continent. The other issue is looking at the statutory system itself, so the laws, and here I'm referring to the land laws, the family laws, and the succession laws, so broadly, not just the one specific legislation, because as you know, all three areas are very important for women's rights. So within that context, we could look at inheritance, which is one of the primary modes of transferring land rights to property rights. And we know that on this continent, there are 9 countries, including our host country, I'm afraid to say, that do not recognize or give equal recognition to inheritance rights to widows. So again, when we're thinking of inheritance, we're looking at both the inheritance as a spouse and the inheritance as a child, as a daughter. And we have 9 countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and others. I'm just making reference to the countries in the region because they are well represented in the group. And the earlier presenter was talking about some of the gender responsive provisions in the Kenyan law. And she had said that one of the positive aspects was that daughters were able to inherit, which is great. But a missing link in that is the spousal piece of it. So that's one of the other problems we see. Another one that's even more common across the continent is the idea of legal capacity. So we see that there's a 2013 study that showed that 22 out of 43 countries on the continent do not formally recognize only men as head of households. So there's a control issue and the legal capacity to manage property. So even in situations where sometimes there's marital property regimes that allow for women to share in the property, the management aspect of it is restricted to a male. So that's another legal issue that's pending. With regards to gaps in the law, you have a lot of there's been a lot of progress in terms of the legislation across the continent. I should put that out in the last 10 years, but these are some of the pending challenges. So one other area that we see this is you have the primary legislation in place, but you don't have the secondary legislation. So for the non-lawyers in the room, we're talking about the regulations to enforce the law. So that's a problem. I'll give an example of Malawi. Malawi in the last few years has passed a lot of progressive laws. I believe it was 11. And yet the secondary legislation or the regulations are still in the process of being enacted. So they undermine the enforcement of these laws. So Malawi is not an exception. This is a problem we see across many countries in Africa. Then looking at representation more broadly, and then you'll see that representations might not be our problem. That some of it is from the women's side, but I think we'll tackle that when we get to the social legitimacy of rights issue. But when looking at actual representation of women on decision-making bodies, whether it's the formal or informal, we see that women are consistently underrepresented, and so they are unable to influence decisions. So that's another key gap that we'll be hearing from our panelists as they reflect on their own specific experiences. Then there's the bigger issue, which is the enforcement aspects of the laws. Women who are trying to enforce their land rights, even when they have the progressive laws, face a hurdle. It's really a web of hurdles when trying to implement those laws and enforce it. Starting with information, there's a huge information gap and knowledge gap. So women who don't know or have access to that information, they not know what their rights are or where and how to enforce it. So that's one big challenge that we see. And to the extent that they have the information and they know where to go, they're also concerned about social sanctions. And because the social legitimacy of those rights may not be in place. So it's not just the legal legitimacy that they're concerned about, but also the social legitimacy. And that's a huge problem across all our countries. Then once women can overcome that social barrier, then they have to deal with yet another barrier, which is the economic barrier. There are lots of service lots of costs associated with land services that women are not well positioned to benefit from because they may not have the means to do so. Even if they overcome that barrier, there's yet another barrier. And here, looking at the capacity within our institutions and the orientation, because the implementers are also part of society, and to the extent that they don't understand the need for the gender responsive provisions, implementation also becomes a challenge. And the last, and there are many more barriers that I'm going to highlight here, is that to the extent that women feel like they've been wronged and are looking for some recourse, they also then encounter problems finding impartial mechanisms for tackling their issues, also in terms of access to those systems, right? So these are sort of some of the major barriers that we see in this area. It's not an exclusive, it's not an exhaustive list of barriers, as I'm sure all of you recognize. But I think it also calls or brings attention to the fact that we have a multitude of issues that we deal with within the context of women's rights. So because the multidimensional nature of these problems, it's really important to tackle it from different angles so that women really are able to exercise those rights. Now turning to the last piece, and then I get to the panelists, is looking at some of the responsive, I've also been asked to contextualize the legal and the policy framework for you. So here, there is a strong consensus on what the women's rights issues are on the continent, and these commitments are in various instruments, starting from 2003, you know, the Critical Declaration that Dr. Janet mentioned yesterday, being one of the key and comprehensive commitments on gender, which also includes land and property rights. Then we have other key decisions that it's a group of decisions and instruments, which is the EU Declaration on Land. Again, Janet mentioned some of this, but I'll just highlight two, which is the EU Declaration on Land Challenges and Land Issues and Challenges in Africa from 2009. That calls for equal access for all, with special attention to be given to gender issues. Then between 2015 and 2019, we have 6 EU STC decisions. And this is, again, Janet also mentioned the STC and what it does within the Commission. So here the commitments are advancing women's documented land rights, that's a 30% target for women's land rights, addressing data gaps, addressing legal gaps with emphasis on inheritance law, promoting women's agency in land reform efforts, and developing continental guideline, which is currently under development. At the global level, we have CDOG from 1981, and I'm going to specifically say in the interest of time. Then we have also in 2012, we have the UTGTs, and they have the technical guides on gender to support implementation of the gender responsive governance instruments. And then the 2015, we have Agenda 2030 on sustainable development goals. Here we have a total of 8 targets and 12 indicators on that. So it's pretty comprehensive in that sense. Now that is I was asked to do that piece of it so that we can contextualize the issues going forward and we can look at the specific areas. So my apologies if it's a little long, but yes, there's a lot on that front, and it's very nuanced, so it's hard to I don't want to miss some of the key areas. So the first question for the discussion is going to be addressed to Nelly on this side. So based on your experience, what are some of the challenges that you've seen in terms of trying to implement the existing laws, and some of the more progressive ways of addressing some of these challenges, and how do you then narrow that gap between the level of practice?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth. I've also been practicing your name. I hope I got it correctly. Thank you very much for those opening remarks for setting the tone. Let me also take the opportunity to congratulate and thank all the speakers who've gone before us. I do think they lay quite a strong foundation which I hope to build upon. There may also be overlaps. Forgive me if you hear repetitions. Let me begin just by highlighting that in South Africa, our constitution recognizes customary law. However, it does state that it should be subjected to the provisions of the constitution. In other words, an application customary law should not contradict the provisions of the constitution. So that is one element. As South Africa, we've heard that our constitution is world renowned, one of the best in the land. It is anchored by, this is just a list of principles, non-exhaustive, of course, equity, justice, non-discrimination, non-sexism, as well as gender equality. So gender equality is key in terms of our constitution. It is cornerstone, it is an imperative of our constitution. These are also reiterated in our Equality Act. We have what we call the promotion of equality, and it is the prevention of equality, promotion of equality and protection against unfair discrimination. We call it PROPIDA, and I want to read what it says specifically on this issue. It states that no person may unfairly discriminate against any person on the grounds of gender, including any policy or conduct that unfairly limits access of women's land rights, including finance and other resources. And of course, we also have quite progressive laws in terms of inheritance and family law. So from a legislative point of view, quite strong in terms of our context in South Africa. However, in practice is that what we see, of course, we see a different picture. So as the Commission for Gender Equality, we conducted a study to unravel the barriers to access to communal land for women. And I want to first highlight or explain how the communal land tenure system is administered in South Africa. It is administered through traditional authorities or traditional leaders, right? And of course, inherently, their role is to protect or preserve culture. And we know that owing to colonialism and apartheid, a lot of the culture we speak of is deeply embedded in patriarchy. So that's where the first set of challenges begin for us. That we entrust the structure to administer land, and it is embedded in this notion of placing men at the center. So that is the first instance of challenges that we see. I want to say that communal land in South Africa is owned by the state, right? So it is just the administrative aspect of it. So how we understand it, in black and white, it is owned by the state. However, in terms of administration, that is done by traditional leaders. And in terms of our structures, I mean, in our laws, there's a recognition of traditional councils, right? And our traditional councils are made up of senior traditional leaders. They have the discretion of selecting 60% of its membership, and then 40% is left to the discretion or nomination of committees on the ground, right? However, there's a provision in the law that 30% of its composition must be made up of women. And in practice, of course, again, we do not see that taking place. When other instances where women are represented, their voice is stifled. I mean, also, I think in your opening remarks, you mentioned that it is a complex system. So you find that as a woman, there are certain cultures and norms and traditions that you must adhere to, such as sitting on the floor, speaking softly, being conservative. Now, of course, when you come down into these structures, your voice is stifled, you're unable to express yourself. So that is one element. But second to that, there's an element wherein the councils are sometimes completely excluded from the process, right? So then the administration process would be undertaken by headmen and headwomen, as well as the senior traditional leader outside of that formal structure. And I also want to underscore an important factor here, that because of male primogeniture that is still quite entrenched in many of our communities, women don't even stand a chance to become a head woman in the job. Let me then just touch on some of the barriers that we uncovered in our research, right? We uncovered, well, first we wanted to look into whether there are any social, economic, as well as legislative barriers to women's access to communal land. And interesting findings emerged from our inquiry. And I must say, it was also quite nuanced because I think it's important that we demystify this misconception that it's all bad. That culture is all bad, all the practices are bad in these rural communities. Our study found that is a different picture. It's quite nuanced. You'd find that in the same province, so South Africa has 9 provinces. In one province where you'd find that there's a dominant tribe, use Zulu for example, because they're quite famous across the continent. You'll find that even within that, they do not do things the same. With our customs, our practices are not the same, right? In that, just a few kilometers down the line, you'd find that this community does respect women's access to communal rights. There's principles of equity and fairness in the allocation processes, nothing wrong. However, you go to another village just close by, then you find that they say in this community, if you are unmarried as a woman, you cannot be given access, right? If you do not have a child, you will not be granted access. So we also uncovered that exists. So I just wanted to paint that picture for us to say it wasn't all bad, it's not all bad. There has been an evolution. I think we all say that culture evolves. It is not static, and we've seen that those changes have sort of come through. However, where there are challenges, so being unmarried as a woman would be a key factor. So if you are a single woman, you'll be subjected to restrictions around inheritance. In fact, I want to read something. It is an extract from a report where a woman said this is an unmarried woman in South Africa. She said, and I quote, "That's why you see many of us here living in shacks in our stands." So shacks are informal structures, I think made of tin. That's the best way I can describe it. And she said, as Ganda women, you are taught from a very young age that you must leave your home because it does not belong to you, but it belongs to your brothers. It is how it is. We are raised like that, close quote. So quite entrenched in terms of their beliefs as well. So unmarried women would face those sort of challenges. Africa, what we learned was that as an unmarried woman, you have to be 40 to be allocated land. So you have to wait all those years. And if you don't get married, then it's a challenge. But if you do, much better. However, we know that even within the marriage institution, it is the man who is recognized. So the registration is done under the man's name, and that is usually done under the guise of culture to say they are protecting the family lineage, the family name. There's also challenges that divorced women experience. Of course, you are told if you're coming into this land, you cannot take it out. It belongs to the ancestors of this land, right? So therefore, experiencing challenges in that sense, you are unable to inherit that property. However, there were quite interesting findings again, where it was said that in some instances, especially if issues are resolved in the community, then couples would reach some sort of consensus. And widows. If your husband dies, if you do not marry into the same family, you have to leave. Sorry, I just got distracted by the time element. I could go on and on about the barriers that we found, especially the exorbitant fees, registration fees, not standard across the board. Women having to cohabitate because of the fear that should this piece of land that I'm occupying be allocated to a man, because there was those issues of double allocations, right? Same piece of land allocated to 2 people. Most instances it's a man and a woman, because as a single woman you're vulnerable, this man can overpower you and take the land, right? I will then move on to the question at hand. What you truly asked me to reflect on. Okay, so you asked what can be done. I don't think it's cast in stone. I don't have all the answers, but these are some of the key issues. Some I picked up during the discussions from yesterday, and I'd like to highlight this one. I think is key. So relevant ministries taking the lead. I have here that most countries do have land ministries or departments. So they should be afraid to rock the boat, to ask relevant questions to traditional structures, and also just harmony being created across the board in terms of the different ministries that exist. In South Africa, you have cooperative governance and traditional leadership. They have a stake. You have the land ministry, you have the women's ministry. I think all three can play a key role with other actors as well. It's important that there's continuous monitoring, evaluation, enforcement, the issue of data. There's a saying that if it's not measured, it does not exist. And I think across many countries, we do struggle. I was shocked to hear the many statistics. I thought we are getting it wrong as a country because it's difficult sometimes to get accurate statistics in around these issues. So it is important that we develop data systems so that we measure progress as well as to what is the baseline and how far we've gone as we implement the laws. There's issues of quotas or minimum targets. There's 30% from the AU. So this could also serve as a key way or an important pathway for increasing women's access to land control and ownership. This look that you're giving me.
This session we have to wrap up by 1, sorry.
Okay.
Earlier session.
All right, so let me just do 2 or 3 more and then I'll hand it over to you. One more. Education and awareness raising, as well as continued advocacy. In order for women to enjoy their rights to land access, they have to first know that they can invoke those rights, so know that it exists, and have the awareness and understanding around the systems that the parameters around which the laws are set. But also those who administer land, there needs to be a transformation in terms of thinking and a mindset shift. I will leave it here. Thank you very much, Asante.
Thank you for that and for reminding us of how dynamic customary systems are and the need to recognize the diversity of these systems and build on what works. And also that numerical representation is not enough, that you have to also do other things to support women be more confident and actively participate. Now moving on to the second question, which is looking at the reform aspects of it, specifically formalization. And the question is addressed to Dr. Filani, and here we're looking at what are some of the persistent challenges associated with documenting women's land rights and some of the procedural and substantive safeguards out there to try and support women.
Hello, is it better now? Okay. Thanks to everyone who has managed to attend, and thank you, moderator. I think that's a very topical issue. But let me just start perhaps very briefly by giving a bit of major historical periods that has led to formalization of property rights in land. I think that, the high modernist ideology that dominated the world just after World War II actually led to formalization as one of the key policies around the global south. Then after that, you also had colonization taking place, and most of the colonial agricultural projects were kind of informed by this modernist ideology. We then had Kenya, 1954, kind of being the first country to adopt titling, the 1954 Swinaton Plan. But we also know that it was disastrous and it resulted in massive rural differentiation with women suffering the most. And then at the end of the Cold War, you have the neoliberal ideology also dominating, and most countries actually adopting market-based land reform, which also entailed formalization of some sort. So it is during that period that you see more than 30 African countries actually adopting some laws with an element of formalization, though different in each context. But we should also remember the 2007 and 2008 global economic crisis, which led to massive land grabbing on the African continent. And one of the responses has been, let us formalize property rights in land so that people and women are able to defend their land. It was actually used in many circles as a proxy for women is land tenure security. And then what has been the implications of this across the continent? I think that the World Bank and some of the international development agencies actually point to Rwanda mostly as a good example, because Rwanda has been able to register about 7 million titles. They also have a digitalized land administration system. Actually, data shows that more women have titles than men in Rwanda. But another example that is usually flagged is Ethiopia. And you also have joint ownership here in Tanzania, being seen as progressive to enhance women's land rights. And the perceptions of women with titles over security of land have also improved. And some conflicts over land boundaries, at least in the short term, have somehow decreased in some countries. But what has been the downside of formalization? I think number one, it has actually accelerated commodification of vernacular land markets on the continent. So this was always going to happen if you think of the Malian cotton zones area in the 1990s. So prices of land are actually skyrocketing, and many vulnerable women are now not able to afford this land. Of course, I know many countries, if you look at the laws, they say that you cannot sell customary land. But this registration process has given a veneer of legitimacy that you can actually sell, and on the ground, there's massive commodification. Then the second issue, for the sake of time, is that the thinking was that formalization was going to unlock the hidden asset of the poor, which is land. Perhaps if we think of the Mystery of Capital by De Soto. But the evidence that we are getting from our research and from others is that there is no hard evidence that has shown correlation between formalization or rural certification and gaining access to credit, improving agricultural productivity, and making massive investments on the land. I've looked at Stein's work here in Tanzania. It's very clear that you cannot establish a definitive correlation. But we have also done work as PLUS in Mozambique, and it's also evident that being given a title on customary land is not equal to getting credit from the banks. I think most of the commercial bank managers we spoke to across the continent were saying, no, for us to be able to give you credit, you must at least be earning as a family about $500 a month. Just coming up with a title is not enough. So poor households still find it difficult. Then the third aspect is that despite the laws on formalization, men still dominate the number of people with titles, and women that are landholders, even if we look globally, it's less than 15% if we look at global data sets. But even if we look at other countries like Senegal, still it's around 15%. Our study of DUATs, which are rural certificates in Mozambique, shows it's 26.6% only for women. women as landholders has not improved. If you go to Egypt, North Africa, it's even worse, that's 4% and so forth. So there's still men dominating. I think one of the contributors earlier on said, some women here in Tanzania are saying, why do we need our names on the document as long as we have got access to the land? That's not peculiar to Tanzania. You hear some of these views right across the continent. But even where you get some married women, because some married women have actually gotten some titles, and they feel that their perceptions of tenure have improved, and that they can now defend their inheritance and so forth. But I remember talking to one lady in Zambia, and she was telling me that no, even though the land is in my name on paper, the person who actually makes decisions over land is my husband. So the title on its own has not been able to transform power and property relations, which means that the issue of women's land rights does not only require a technical fix, but it demands us to go beyond that. And I agree with Naledi here that single women are suffering the most, even under formalization. She was talking about under customary tenure regimes. So what is happening is that you get usually the husband and the wife co-registering, or sometimes the husband alone. And then the single women without children and the young women, they feel that they are being excluded in some context there. And the thinking is that you are imposing a foreign concept of ownership on a family-based system of land rights. I've seen that Senegal has tried to register each and every name of the household on the paper, but that's first-time registration. When you go to the second-time registration, and when the girl child gets married, the tenure dynamics also change. And second from last, what has happened is that many countries are failing to understand what is customary tenure. Therefore, formalization is struggling. So you would realize that the registration of common property resources is very difficult. So what you get registered usually is your household area or maybe your small field. But what about the common property resources where women have to rely on to sustain their livelihood? Mozambique is trying to do that through the DUAT, but on the ground, it's not actually happening. And this is part of the land that is being deposited into the so-called land banks. But it's land that is very useful for women on the continent. Then formalization has also been accompanied by new land administration systems. That's my last point. The new land administration systems. So these new land administration systems are still being trumped by your religious and customary institutions. So the laws are there, but in many cases they are not being considered as socially legitimate. So lastly, moderator, I want to say that class is also a key issue in terms of formalization. What we observed talking to more than 700 families across the continent is that that well-to-do women, your middle class, tend to get better benefits from formalization than the income poor and vulnerable women who see land more as territory than land as capital. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting some of the issues around formalization and the historical context. Yes, formalization has a strategy, has both advantages and disadvantages, as you said. And there is a need to have greater studies to substantiate some of the linkages with the development outcomes, but that's not to say they don't exist, because we haven't done sufficient studies to necessarily understand the full impact of it. But there have been studies on both Rwanda and Ethiopia where they have showed some benefits at the household level, but not all the benefits that are usually expected with formalization efforts. Thank you. We'll move on to the. So, in the interest of time, I'm trying to see how to do this because it's now we have 20 minutes till 1, and we have 3 speakers to go. We will go a little over to the 1 because the earlier session went over by an hour. So I think we have to have a little wiggle room to hear, but we'll bear that in mind when we answer the next set of questions, please. So now we are looking at some of the mechanisms and looking at some of the threats, both at the household level and at the community level at large. So the first question I'm going to be addressing to Samantha, and then the second will be addressed to Matilda, who I accidentally forgot to introduce. I am so sorry. And so I will introduce you before we go to your question. Starting with Samantha, we're focusing on some of the intra-household dimensions. What are some of the mechanisms that can be put in place to resolve land disputes involving women, and how can these be made more accessible?
All right, thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference. So without wasting much of your time, I will just be talking in brief about the specific conflicts that women in Africa are facing. We know, and in the discussions that have been happening yesterday and today, we have seen that women in Africa continue to face numerous challenges in securing and maintaining their land rights, despite the legal and policy frameworks that guarantees them equal access to their land rights. So now my question is to highlight the conflicts that women in Africa are facing with regards to secure land rights, and also try to come up with the mechanisms, what we can do so that women are protected. So first of all, there are disputes that are happening in Africa, and I will be specifically focusing on Zimbabwe. So in Zimbabwe, we face disputes in terms of inheritance, in terms of divorces, in terms of boundary disputes. More of topical now is farmer-miner disputes. I will try to explain on farmer-miner disputes. In Zimbabwe, there is more prevalent mining, so many miners come in the places where the farmers are staying or the women are staying, polluting the land and also affecting their way of living. For example, when they come to mine, they do not even give, they don't even consult, they just come and do their mining, they pollute the land, their water is polluted, causing death of young children, causing death of livestock and all that. So that issue in how to resolve that dispute concerned with farmer-miner, I think it's best to facilitate dialogues and negotiations between farmers and miners to find a common ground, so that when they are coming to the land, they will first have to negotiate so that the women and the miners, they have a common ground and they discuss, and also it will help them so that there won't be disputes, because that is the main topical disputes that farmers, women farmers in communal areas are facing. With regards to inheritance disputes, in most parts of Zimbabwe, land is traditionally inherited through the male line, disinheriting women and daughters, their daughters or girls. So in order to resolve that dispute, I think there is need to enforce laws that protect women's land rights, especially in the context of inheritance and divorce. And there is also an issue to do with divorces. During divorce proceedings, women may face difficulties in securing their land rights and other assets acquired after marriage or during the marriage. So there is need to reform the customary laws that are not discriminatory, to ensure that gender equality in land ownership and in inheritance are well taken care of. Also, there is need to strengthen land administration systems to improve land tenure security and reduce land-related conflicts. Also, there is need to empower women's groups that advocates for women's rights and mediate some of the land disputes. Another mechanism is also to do with providing women with legal aid and training so that they are able to assert their land rights. Also, we can support women's land access in terms of involving the ministries, the local government in training women so that they know their rights. They do not know their rights, so it's important that women are always aware of their land rights. Lastly, I would just like to highlight that in Zimbabwe, we need to implement gender-sensitive land policy. It's in draft form, but now we need it to be implemented so that it addresses some of the disputes that women are facing with regards to their land rights. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, for highlighting the different types of conflicts and some of the mechanisms, including the legal aid to support legal literacy. Thank you. Now we'll turn to Matilda. My apologies again for not introducing you earlier. So Matilda is from Mozambique and represents the practitioner stakeholder on this panel, similar to Samantha here. The question that's addressed to her is with regards to the broader conflicts around issues of displacement. So how does displacement exacerbate some of the gender exclusion and inequality around land? And what are some of the things we need to do to specifically support displaced women? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. It's an honor being here. I'd just to congratulate the owners, the organizers of the event. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Plus, for bringing me here. Well, here about the question. First, before answering directly, I'd just like to highlight that displacement, as you mentioned, it can happen through two motives: the natural causes and the human causes. So when the natural causes, we see the floods, cyclones, etc., and the human causes conflict at the majority. But yesterday, for example, a speaker said here that, for example, the climate change is insensitive to gender, is not sensitive to gender, whether when floods come, doesn't choose if it's women or men or children, they affect everyone. But the thing is, when it comes to women, it's more drastically. You know why? Because when this displacement happens, automatically they force they reduce this little power of defense that we as women we have. For example, they modify all the system, modify everything. For example, the women that has registered their land, they lost the documents, and sometimes it's very hard to recover these documents. That way becomes the fragile of the fragilization of the institution, as mentioned before here. And some of the other causes that also weakness this land tenure to women are the inheritance rights, especially on patriarchal societies. As we well know, the patriarchal societies, they reduce the women. So this is one of the problems that we have in Mozambique. Actually, in 2023, PLUS and the University of Western Cape, they did a study, the study that Dr. Pilani just mentioned, and this study was made in Yamatanda district in Sofala province that was hit by Idai cyclone in 2019. And this study shows that during registration, men tended to impose patriarchal beliefs, and this excluded women from registering their lands. Although you can believe that 74.3% of women in Yamatanda, they are headed of the family, but instead, none of this happened, allows the women to have the certificate of land. And so the other thing is just we can see that this displacement allows to a certain situation that make more difficult these women to have access and control and the access, control, and the documentation of their lands. What can we do, for example? I think the first thing to do is it was mentioned here before that Mozambique is one of the greatest land laws, etc. But I believe that the first thing to do is to cover the land, the law gaps that was mentioned here, especially I will be aligning the legal framework and policies about displacements. So this law might be aligned with displacement scenarios. Also, we can see there is needed education and awareness raising related to the security of land tenure, access to income generating opportunities to women, starting with the land. Most of the people in Mozambique in rural area, they are farmers and smallholder farmers, especially women. And just giving an example, the Livaningo, we are implementing 2 projects in Yamatanda district. These projects are related to climate change resilience. We are helping local communities, especially women, to have the access to the land so they can farm there and to have something, a source of income. And also another example, this is an example about the natural disaster, but about the human cause, especially the conflict. As well know, I think many of you in this room know that in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado province, we are facing terrorism. So we are also implementing a project there in Cabo Delgado, in Shuri district, with IDPs and also with some refugees, and we also helping them to recover the economic power, and it all starts with the land. I don't know if something is escaping me here, but it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Matilda, for focusing on the exacerbating factors. Last but not least, we have a question that looks at some of the promising practices, and it's going to be addressed to Honorable Nanette. Maybe we can limit it to 5. Okay. So we can have a few minutes for the floor.
I'll try. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers. After hearing all these setbacks on women's land rights, we all agree that it requires a multi-faceted approach to address the social, cultural, economic, and legal factors that hinders women's rights. And what I know is rights should never be treated as a favor or a privilege, because in many countries, I think women have shown that they have got capacity to use land. I can highlight for Zimbabwe, the land reform program in 2000. We have got few women who managed to get land, and they are doing great. And I believe in other nations like Rwanda, Tanzania, they are doing a lot. And the rights, we cannot just talk of rights, because the rights should be also supported by a legislation. Therefore, there is also need for legal and policy reform. Governments must enact laws, and also I believe that the laws, some of them are there, but I think it's lacking enforcement. So I think governments must enforce gender-sensitive land laws. There's also need for statutory recognition of customary law to safeguard the women, especially those who are in our rural areas. There is also need for legal recognition of women's inheritance issues, especially the girls. There is also need for land reform, and on land reform, I think we must make sure that we also address the gaps, especially the gaps in knowledge, the gaps or in also information. A lot of women, they don't even have much knowledge on their women land rights. We must also make sure that we also promote the issue of joint and land ownership and titling. For example, in Kenya, they've proved that they are doing a lot, because they also have land ownership programs which are also promoting women, and their laws also help to reduce the risk of women in displacements. I think we must also highlight the issue of providing incentives. Our governments must make sure that they provide incentives, especially for those who promote the joint titling. We must also strengthen our land administration. I'm not going to take much on it because it has been highlighted. The issue also is about the community-based approaches. You know, sometimes we also lack the issue of ownership. We have got women who are in the rural areas. So I strongly feel that we must empower women's groups, empower our NGOs for them to advocate for women's land rights, so that they also have power. You can highlight, for example, in Tanzania and Rwanda, they have shown that they are doing enough in empowering women, because they have got community programs, so that they also promote the issue of community dialogue. There's also the issue of land restitution and compensation. I strongly feel that we must make sure that we try by all means to implement, because if you go like South Africa, they've got these programs. Even in Zimbabwe, someone was talking about Zimbabwe. If you recall the issue of the discovery of diamonds in Chiatswa, women were displaced. So we totally need the issue of the compensation to the land. There's also the issue of education and awareness. Laws alone are not enough to secure women's rights. So we need to effect all these laws through education and training. If we educate women, obviously we'll go a long way in terms of the land rights. The issue of capacity building, training, especially on financial literacy, because if they have their money, they must also have the knowledge on how to spend it. We must also highlight on the issue of advocating and lobbying. On advocating, I think we must also try by all means to lobby our legislators in our parliaments to make sure that whenever they also do their budgets, their budgets must be gender sensitive and gender responsive so that women are also aware. We must also lobby for the ratification of all these national agreements and laws, because it doesn't make sense to have all these, but our parliament or our nation does not implement. We can talk of the CEDAW, and what I know is most of the parliaments, they agree, but in terms of implementation, they don't implement. I also want to highlight the alignment of our statutory instruments and customary law to institutional provisions, because it is key to protect women's rights, especially when we talk about the communal lens. We must also try by all means to promote women's access in justice through legal aid. What I know is in terms of disputes, they cannot even allow themselves to go for their legal affairs. Let me just highlight one in terms of the monitoring and evaluation. What I know is we have good laws, but when you go for the issue of tracking on what we have achieved and what we have done, the issue is also lagging. So I strongly feel that we must also try by all means to have it. But lastly, because I come from the side of leadership, I also strongly feel that we must also lobby for women's leadership, because this is where these decisions are being made. This is where the laws are also being made. So for us to lobby for this, it is also going to help us in local government, also in parliament, so that we also have good laws. And above all, I think there is need for political will in our parliament. I thank you.
Thank you, and sorry for rushing you. Thank you for highlighting the different types of interventions and the need for both collective agency and leadership roles for women, and making some recommendations on the way forward. In the interest of time, we've changed the format. Initially, we were hoping to have the opportunity to hear from you after each thematic area, but because of the time constraints, we had to change the format. We can take 3 questions now, and then we're going to provide the PLAS email if you have further questions, so we can respond after the session. The email address is info@plas.org.za for those who are interested in follow-up questions. So we'll open the floor for 3 questions on any of the interventions. Thank you. Go ahead, could you introduce yourself and your organization before your question, please?
My name is Maritim Weldon, Director of Service from the Republic of Kenya. I did a presentation yesterday, and today it is becoming interesting because women are still lamenting. And we pray that by the end of this conference, women will have gained their freedom. Now, there is something in other areas of governance, like in the Republic of Kenya, we have the land control boards. These are boards which control the transactions on land. When a family, for example, when a man wants to sell a property or subdivide for sale, there is an approval that is sought from the land control board. Then there is a requirement that for you to do that, you have to be accompanied by your wife in many instances. But at some point, it was abused. A man could go in one of the markets, he will pick one of the women to pretend to be his wife. Then they will go and endorse the sale of a property. So you see, there is a man here who wants to sell her. He's gone, but he decides that I don't want to go with this woman who is the wife. I will go and pick another woman who is ready to betray these are the women. They will sell the property, then the property will go. So who are we blaming here? Are we blaming the man? Are we blaming the wife? Are we for ignorance? Are we blaming this woman who is betraying the wife? Or are we blaming the devil who is very common everywhere? Because some of these things women are undergoing sometimes are total contribution by themselves. Because how can you allow, even if you don't know the other woman who is being deprived of her right, why do you allow yourself to be used by the devil? I'm not saying you who are seated there,
I hope
but those women who are not here,
Yeah, I know.
to be used
All right,
by
thank you. We got the question.
How can we baptize women so that their inner systems can have that virtue which will be defending the other women, regardless of their tribes or where they are in this world?
Okay, thank
Because
you.
if you don't do so, men are going to be men all the time, and you will be women all the time.
All right, thank you for the question. Well noted. Moving on to the next question, we'll move to this section and then I'll come back here. Godfrey.
Thank you. My name is Godfrey Masai and I work for Landesa as well as a student at MPhil student at class. So my questions are to Pilani and Naledi so they can choose who will respond. But one on the perception of tenure. My own research in Kilosa and in Morogoro are telling me that women feel more secured when they have certificate. And even if they have access to land without certificate, they feel like they are insecure. I would want your reaction on that, because I think most of your argument were against that. And two is on the forum shopping. You know, there has been debate on formal institutions and informal institutions. Research on the ground are showing that women have used both traditional systems and the institution or the legal system to access their rights. And when they fail, for example, in court, they will resort to the local institution and get their rights. Or when they lose in the local institution, they will go to court and get their rights. So it has played to their advantage. And lastly, just a comment to make a reference to the FAO methodological guidance. It is based on the SDG indicator 5A2. This one is putting a global framework to measure all the laws and policies and the extent to which they secure or guarantee women land rights. There are 6 proxies or principles that can be used. They are global. So please have familiarized with it and measure your own countries based on those standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Yeah, thank
That's
you.
our final question.
So my name is Eric Nyadimo, the President, Institution of Surveyors of Kenya. 2 points. What are the positive aspects that have come as a result of the campaigns that we have had for quite some time now on the rights of women on land? I think as we talk about the women rights on land, we should now change the focus and start talking about the positive aspects that have come, so that we can be able to see whether we can encourage those countries or which have not instituted those kind of measures to be able to apply, rather than just talking about the complaints, so to speak. The other aspect is in line with what the Director of Survey has indicated. He said that we have the Land Control Board, and the Land Control Boards require that you go with your wife and provide consent. But also in Kenya now we have seen that we have come up with what we are calling spousal consent. Now, the spousal consent means that your wife or the spouse needs to sign off if you want to send your land. The problem is that over time, this spousal consent, if, for example, I want to sell my land and my wife has refused, it's leading to conflicts. It's even leading to people killing one another. So we need to try and understand, is this spousal consent really necessary to be put in law if it is leading to such kind of conflicts, or what measures can be taken to mitigate such kind of things? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So who would like to answer the first question? And that was the question about essentially the social legitimacy of these rights and some of the incidents of manipulating or trying to get around the rules because one does not necessarily subscribe to the mindset. Okay, I was asking who wants to take the first question. Okay.
I will trying only. Well, first of all, I think that one of the problem is the self-consciousness. Okay, so if that woman accepts to go there with another man that is going to sell another woman's land with the man, she doesn't know how to put herself in the place of the other woman. That's one of the things. And also to the man is a very high level of lack of respect for his spouse. And the institution, I think that is also guilty because it's not only going there with another woman and say, this lady, she's my wife and we are coming here and she has consent to sell this property. I believe that, in Mozambique, for example, for the recognition of the land, if the law says that if you don't have the certificate, you need to have a testimony. That's it? Yes. People that says, okay, this person is using these lands for more than 10 years. I am the grandfather living here. I saw. Okay, so it's needed to have someone to witnesses. I believe that witnesses will also be one of the way, but might choose someone else also to testify. So comes to what I said before is something related to self-consciousness. Okay, so if someone is crazy, it has to go and turn that people in the hospital because there's no other solution to it.
Thank you. I'll just add that, conflict is part of the game in the sense that when you shoot power dynamics, you're bound to have some conflict. And until now, women have been on the receiving end. Whenever you have change, you try to minimize the conflict, but there's going to be some sort of conflict when you change power dynamics, right? And in the case of Ethiopia, one of the ways they got around people bringing somebody else's wife or their girlfriend is requiring that they're both on their certificates, there are photos of both the male and the female, so you can verify. Now, to the second question, it was addressed to this side of the room, so I will leave it to both of you to answer in any sequence that you choose.
The doctor will sum it up. So the question of certification, I do think that's a good point, and it is true because at least it gives us some form of legitimacy, right? However, the challenge is that in South Africa, the certificate you get is a permission to occupy certificate, so it's not a title. What that essentially means is that you are formally given permission to occupy a piece of land, but it's not yours. So what it means for women is that you cannot even use it as collateral if you're applying for loans, etc. But I also think that it works best when there are strong accountability mechanisms and enforcement. Alluding now to the example I made earlier of corruption, you'd find that there's double allocation. So both of you come with a certificate that bears your name. And now it's a conflict in the community. And because there is no oversight, no accountability over the structures that administer land, then the conflict is left for the two of you or three of you to resolve. So I do think it has some legitimacy, and it's a good point. Your name reflects on it, then you know that you can, use the land for economic activities, for residential, etc. But there must be strong accountability measures in place.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the fascinating inputs. Yeah, but perhaps before I come to Godfrey's question, just quickly to say the example that was given by the director. I think there are underlying issues there that we cannot brush aside. I think the first one is that we need to understand uneven power relations that exist. So we need to understand power and property relations, because more often, even if you have spouse consent, does the woman or the partner or the wife have real power to say no to the husband, given some of the cultural and social context? So what we need is a much more gender transformative approach rather than just a gender sensitive approach. Otherwise, we might end up blaming people who are also victims of entrenched patriarchy. Then coming to your findings in Tanzania, they are very exciting because they speak to our own findings as well. And even if you look at the global surveys by Prindex, that the perceptions of tenure security tend to increase for women who hold certificates compared to those without. So they speak to our findings. But we must understand that this is quite subjective, isn't it? Because it's perception. And even if people might feel that they are perceived that we are more tenure secure, we know that in reality, they can still be displaced by the big mining companies, by the state processes of urbanization. You have climate change, all these multiple pressures on land. So those perceptions doesn't stop their vulnerability to displacement. But yes, it does speak to that. Then lastly, there's a question that I think there have been many positives, and I think they should be highlighted. But we should also be conscious of the fact that issues, especially of customary tenure reform, must speak to historical and social circumstances. I don't think one size fits all is going to address this problem in terms of just global indicators. In some cases, rural certification might work, but in others it might not work. The nature of the common property rights might not even be registrable in some cases. The boundaries